Good morning. Good to be together for a little while this morning. And I'm going to be over in 1 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians, chapter 6. If you want to find that spot, we'll be there in a couple of minutes. Just want to say thanks for the great weekend. And what a great God we serve. What a great privilege it is to live for Him. I was reading an old book, and the man was talking about trials, and he said, if God were to save our soul and give us nothing but a cross to bear the rest of our life, we would rejoice knowing that we were saved and on our way to heaven. And but us, we've got so many blessings. We get used to the blessings. We get used to, the looking out my window at the nice weather and thinking about our frozen friends around the country, and we can get grumbling pretty good. But the worst day in America is better than the best day in most other countries, especially if you start going back hundreds of years and see the difficulties and the burdens that people bear. And there's no end of hardships and struggles that people face. I did want to mention, we're handing out these update cards during the month of really February to March. Trying to keep up with who's a part of our church, and we've got people that are here, some people that are in the parking lot, people that are at home, and I want to encourage you, don't live in fear, but do what you think is best for you. I think my personal opinion is we've been lied to a lot by just about everybody except God, and but you have to, in your own heart, do what you think is best for you. But I want to encourage you, a couple of thoughts about our whole COVID situation. We have been almost a year now with masks and social distancing, and it's not stopped, slowed the curve, slowed the spread, whatever you want to call it. It's the COVID sicknesses as they reported them, if they were honest, which they aren't. But they're still going on, and so I just want to encourage you, do what you think's right to do, and don't worry about it. I said the other day, if I thought I had to stay inside to keep from dying, and not be in church, not be around my children, not be around my grandchildren, if I had to die, literally be imprisoned in my own home, so that I could live, I think I'd just rather do what I'm supposed to do and leave it in God's hands. But everybody's got to make that call on their own. And but back to the cards, I would encourage you, if you wouldn't mind, letting us know if you're home and not out to church much. Send a phone call, leave a phone message, whatever. Send a text. Let us know that you're a part of our church online, and there's nothing wrong with that. These are awkward days for people, but as a church, we need to know who our membership is and who to get information to, and keeping up with the church. It's we're not a lodge or a business. This is a relationship of people, and it's important we know who is in our church. And so I want to encourage you, be in touch. And also, those cards are updating cell phones, if you don't mind us having them, and then email addresses. And then so we can keep things together. You should have, in the last couple of days, received a newsletter from us, either email or a physical mail. If you didn't, then please be in contact with the office, and we can send them out for free email, the newsletter. But if you'd like a physical one, then just let the office know, and we'll make sure you get on our mailing list. We want everybody to know what's going on and to stay in touch. March is our March Gladness month, and we'll be talking about that. We have a gladness offering instead of the March Madness basketball craziness going on. And I had another scribble here. I want to remind you to pray. Pray for our revival meeting. So the first week in March, next week, we'll have a group of us going to Kentucky. 26 or 27 of us going to the Young Fundamentalist Conference. Just a chance for our young people to gather together with 1,000 or more other teenagers from like churches and preaching. And there'll be some fun, but a time of challenge to serve God. and at least say to God, I'm available. If you want my heart, you want my life. Everybody's got to, between them and the Lord, what they do, those decisions. But we want our young people surrendered. And so if you'd be praying about that. And then the following week is our revival week, our spring revival, Sunday to Sunday. We'll have preaching each day, each night, and soul winning each day. And if you would take time to pray, and we have been fasting and praying and asking God's blessing on our country, on our state, on our churches, plural, as well as our church. America's churches are needy. They're very needy. And then on us individually. And I've encouraged people to pray and to take some time to fast. But in regard to that week, would you ask God to lead us to people, that people would get saved, that we'd reach new families in our church? There's a lot of people moving to our area, and perhaps they're saved and need a church. Maybe they're not saved and need to get saved. But would you pray for that week? That would be important. And then also just a thought, because of the last year messing up colleges and everything, we are recreating our missionary college student program, where our young people, where our missionaries we support around the world send their children back to America to college. And we try to just do something for them. Just, it's your birthday, and send them a gift card to Walmart or whatever. And we want to be in touch with the students of our missionaries. Osmond Gutierrez, one of our missionaries, his son is a freshman in Bible college in Indiana. And Brother Greg Schoof, he and his wife and family were here just a few weeks ago. And he's got two of his kids. His two oldest are freshmen in Bible college, also there at Howes Anderson. And so we've got a handful of our college students and their parents. These are young people who grew up on a mission field. They're not Americans. They may be by blood and they may be legally on paper, but they're from Kenya or they're from Honduras or wherever, and now they're dropped into an American college. And I just think, just a note here and there, gift. Our adult Sunday school class, just on the refreshment table, for the last couple of years, just had a jar. They drop in $0.25 or $1, and we sponsored Allison and Brittany de Mobile, and those girls, their dad Randy, his parents from our church, he was from our church, and we were able to just send money now and then, just a check to let them know we're praying for them. And so, if you'd like to adopt a college student, there's just so many things to do to be a blessing. This world eats up our money. I see a commercial once in a while on these poor pets that need adopted. And I think, man, people matter. Animals are not bad. I like animals, but people matter. And people are eternal. And let's invest in the work of God. Let's invest in the people of God. And let's get our priorities right in our finances. And so things that we can do to help the work of God. And I want to mention, again, I'm going to get over to 2 Corinthians 6 in a moment here. But I've got a book here. Most Christians, if you've been in church or around church as much, you've heard of George Mueller. Miracle work in England. And George Mueller's work was unique because he was a pastor. In the day, they rented pew space. And the better pews that were comfortable and had heat, those cost more. And if you were poor, you'd stand in the back. You wouldn't even have a place to sit. And George Mueller was reading in James where it talks about us preferring one over another and giving more respect to the people with money than the common guy. And he says, do not rich men oppress you? Do they not draw you before the judgment seats? And it's the wealthy who can afford the attorneys to bring you to trial or to court. And and that's the book of James. It's nothing new. The corruption of wealth and the corruption of the legal system is not new. And it bothered George Mueller. He felt like his church was preferring the rich over the poor. So, and that was how the pastor got paid, was through pew rent. And so George Mueller, he and his wife just said, we're not doing this anymore. So they put a box at the back of the church and said, if you'd like to have the Muellers get a paycheck, put some money in here. And then there was no pew rent. You come in, you sit down wherever you want. That was the beginning of George Mueller living by faith. Well, then he got burdened about the orphans on the streets in England, and he was especially burdened for the lack of faith in the people of God, the inability to trust God for our daily needs. And he started an orphanage totally by faith. And he brought in a few students and a few more and a few more, and he's renting a house, and he's renting 2 houses, and he's bringing in staff that he's got to pay, and then he's got clothing, and he's got teachers, because these kids were there 24/7, and there was teachers to pay, and clothing, and food, and school supplies, and desks, and furniture, and beds, and you name it, all the stuff. Well, then there was 100, and then there was 200, and there was 300. I think he was up around 5 or 6, maybe 700. Maybe higher than that. It's been a while since I've read his biography. But George Mueller's an amazing man. And most people know Mueller. He wrote a lot. And typically the person who writes is the person who's remembered. But from the text here in 2 Corinthians 6, I wanted to bring about this book. Now, this is a neat organization. This is an organization that finds books they feel are historically valuable, and they scan them and reprint them in their original, or as originals they can find, context. So you can see this, it's small pages put into big pages. And this group, they print all kinds of books, secular as well as sacred, they would call it. But this is called The Life of Augustus Herman Frank. Now, I'd be willing to say that probably no one has heard of Augustus Herman Frank. And so I brought this book, and it's got some neat stories in it. It tells about his conversion. He was in a good home in Germany, fairly well off financially. He was in school, and then he advanced so fast his dad got tutors for him, and he went, and at 13 he was so smart he was going to go to the university, but he suffered so much harassment from his peers because he was so young that he came back home, worked for a couple of years at home. He had private tutors teaching him Hebrew and Greek and Latin, and along the way he learned French, and he was just smart. But he was in his 20s before, and this is the late 1600s, and he was in his 20s when he wrestled with this matter of salvation. In 1 year, he read the Hebrew Bible through 5 times. He knew the scriptures. He had a knowledge. He had a brain just quick to grab things. And he was told by his Hebrew teacher, master the first 3 chapters or 5 chapters, I forget what it was, of Genesis. Just go through it. Just read those over and over and over and over and over in Hebrew. Learn every word. Well, that's attainable. You got this giant book, but I only got to worry about 5 chapters. Well, then his Hebrew teacher told him, you just learned after several weeks of working and maybe months, I forget how long, he said, you just mastered 1/3 of the Hebrew vocabulary. And he thought, wow, it was an interesting way to teach. And so this is a guy who is very knowledgeable of the scriptures, knowledgeable of ancient languages, and yet he wrestled with his salvation, the matter of, was he a Christian? What did he do with his guilt? He wrestled with whether there was a God. And then at one point, I was just reading in here, he's struggling. He says, if there's not a God, who is it that's causing this grief in my heart? If there's not a God, why do my eyes fill with tears over my sinfulness? And the spiritual wrestling that went on in this man's life. And again, 1670, 1680 is this era. He's a young adult, late teens, early 20s. And he finally comes to the knowledge of Jesus Christ and accepts Christ by faith, humbles himself, broken before God, and he is saved. It's a great story of Augustus Herman Frank. Now, why do I bring this up? And why George Mueller? You read the story of George Mueller, and what you'll find is that George Mueller says his huge ministry to orphans was inspired by the ministry of Augustus Frank. And Frank became very burdened for the orphans in Germany. And he got where he would have 1,000 orphans, and his buildings were enormous. And this morning I Googled his name and his ministry. the orphan house in Hale, Halle. And the buildings, it looks like a state university campus, 5, 6, 7-story buildings and multiple buildings, huge buildings and multiple buildings, 3 and 4 and 5 stories. And it's on this giant campus where he cared for them. And he did it all like Mueller did, by faith. Here's the point. George Mueller, world famous, books written about him everywhere. And I hadn't even heard of Frank until a few years ago when I was reading another biography of George Mueller. I'd read several. And this was the autobiography. George Mueller wrote his own. And in that biography, George Mueller says, it was Augustus Frank that stirred me and challenged me. And I thought, I haven't even heard of the man who inspired the man that is so admired and respected, George Mueller. And it got me thinking. If you look with me at 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul is writing about the things that made him approved as a minister. And not just him, but the preachers in his era, the apostles. And in verse 4, he says, but in all things approving ourselves as the ministers of God. So he says, in all these situations, we are approving ourselves as the ministers of God. And the preposition in. And there's a long list. In. And so if you could mark these because it outlines itself. In verses 4 and 5, he is approved as a minister in these situations. And then if you look at verse 6 and 7 and 8, the word by pureness, by knowledge, by long-suffering, by kindness. And there's 3 verses of, so while he is in these situations, he is approved as a minister by his long-suffering while he is in hunger. He is approved as a minister of God by the power of the Holy Spirit while he is in watchings and fastings. And so you got the in, the things, situations he finds himself in, and then the by is how he acted or the things that proved him to be who he said he was. And then down at verse 9 and 10 is the third word, as. You've got in and by and as. And in verse 9 and 10, as means while I'm in these situations and by these things I am approved as a minister of God as. And these are the things people thought of him. The as is as if we were. And he says in verse 9, as unknown yet well known, as dying yet behold we live, as chastened but not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing yet possessing all things. And so a very worthy outline to take time to meditate on. Excuse my voice this morning. I need another cup of tea. But by but in and by and as. Now, I just want to pull out one little line here because not a time for a sermon. But in verse 9, he says, as unknown and yet known. As unknown yet well known. And I was thinking about comparing Frank to George Mueller. George Mueller was very well known, but behind the scenes, there was an Augustus Frank. Now, he had an enormous ministry. He wrote a lot. He was brilliant as a theologian, a man capable of writing and preaching the Word of God. He got to the point in his college days where he could take any doctrine and find plenty of scripture to support his. He knew scripturally why he believed everything he believed, and he still wasn't saved. But the point is, you've got an unknown Augustus Frank. You've got a very well-known George Mueller. The world has given George Mueller no end of accolades. The world gave Frank, other than in his life, right at the moment, the people that knew him knew he was special, but no one understood the influence 100 years later. This man lived and died and was, in a sense, forgotten. That little region knew him. His buildings are still there, as far as I understand. And but 100 years later, his life touched the life of George Mueller, and George Mueller changed the world in regard to faith and preaching and the ministry and the love for orphans. And Paul the Apostle says, I'm in these situations, I'm dealing with them in this way, and it's like I'm unknown. No one knows me, yet I know I'm known by God as unknown and yet well known. And I just thinking through the Christians, the people who influence us, there are some great people that when we bury them, when we say goodbye to them, they quickly become an unknown. We can forget people that influence us. And I try on purpose, when I start sitting about being thankful, I'll go back to a Becky Manley, the young college intervarsity lady who organized a campus ministry where I was learned to study the Bible and to witness. And then there's a Ross Llewellyn, a guy a couple of years older than me, who the first person that took me out witnessing, gave me the old campus crusade track, 4 Spiritual Laws, and taught me to go through that with someone. And there were people. Nick Bruno was the assistant pastor for Pastor Blue up in Redding, California. Nick Bruno, he was one of the best, if not the best, Bible teacher I ever had. His ability to communicate Scripture in a way that it stuck with you and that it meant something. It didn't just stick with you mentally. It meant something in your heart. And there was a Pastor Dean Lambert who would drive from the Redding area up into the mountains toward where I was a short time between secular college and Bible college. And it was a 2-hour drive on, I forget, Tuesday or Wednesday nights. I think there was no pastor at the church in that town at the time, and he would come up and have a midweek nighttime Bible study. And I remember him teaching Bible prophecy and fulfilled prophecies, and as a young Christian, a young college-age man saved a year and a half, to the authentication of the Scriptures through prophetic fulfillment, and all that stuff just was so real to me. And he, here he drove a couple of hours to teach an hour or two, to drive a couple of hours back on a weeknight. I don't know if he got any money for it. Looking back, I don't remember an offering plate. I don't know who organized it. But there are people, the young man that led me to Christ in a city park, Lanny True, he was dating my wife at the time, and she was a sophomore in high school, sophomore, junior, and I was a senior. So she was a sophomore, I was a senior, and that was his girlfriend, and he ended up leading me to Christ. And there are people that influence us along the way, and I try to not forget those people. I try to go back, and yesterday I was thinking of Pastor Les Smith. Got saved later in life, not as a child, but surrendered his life. He went to Bible college as an adult, a married man, and it's hard to go to college. It's harder to go to college when you're trying to find a way to feed your family, and it's time to study and go to school days, work nights, try to be a dad and a husband. Left there, went to Augusta, Georgia. Started a very successful church, and then Dr. Hiles hired him to come back and teach. And just for a couple of years, he taught there at Hiles Anderson College, where I was attending. And he had a huge effect on my life and on a lot of young men. Pastor Mike Johnson up in Redding, also very, very deeply impacted by this man, Les Smith. Well, he taught a couple years and left. I've not heard of him since. I don't know anything about his ministry, where he went, but I know this: I'm going to do my best to not forget him. Now, there in 2 Corinthians 6:9, he said, it's as if we're unknown, yet we know we're well known. You have several thoughts this morning, just real quick. Number one, you have no idea who you're influencing. Just no idea whatsoever. Herman Frank never heard the name George Mueller. Mueller was 100 years later. But Herman Frank made a global impact through his faith and life. Although he did not have a global impact, his impact on George Mueller did. And you don't know who you're touching. You don't know who that person you're sitting by. If you've been in our church often, you've heard me talk about the little elderly ladies who sat together in the little church that was there in the town where I got saved on a Wednesday, left for college on Saturday, and really was never back there long after that. um, was going to church when I did get going to church in Northern California in Redding at Pastor Blues in North Valley Baptist. But I remember the few times I was at that little church with my friends, I'd slip in with them, and there's these, I want to say they were sisters, but they are in my mind, and they affected the young people, because you never miss those three ladies sitting together in church. You just never would. Sad to say, there's no spiritual men that stuck in my mind in that place. There were two or three pastors. There was a pastor, Al Porticalian, been in heaven for some time. He had a big impact on us. I remember coming home at Christmas, and he took a group of young people up into the mountains. There was a frozen stream, and then a big pond, and took a bunch of us up there ice skating. And he was a collector. He had cross-country skis for dozens and dozens of sets, and he had dozens and dozens of ice skates, and he'd been in I think Minnesota, and so he worked with young people there, and he brought all that to California, and he loved the winter sports. And I remember ice skating around a pond with Al Porticalian as he's teaching me church doctrine and Bible. We didn't have a Bible out, but he's quoting scripture and teaching me, and here I am, a young college student, in the middle of the night, in the dark. They had bonfires out around the lake, but skating around this lake, listening to him talk about church polity, the running of a church. And who knows who we're impacting. And I don't know if he ever knew anything about our ministry here. I never saw him again after those days. He went somewhere and left the area. I knew his son. But the impact, and the point is this: you don't know who you're impacting. You walk in the church doors and greet people and be in your place in the choir or orchestra, work the church nursery, you're an usher, whatever it might be. You're in your place and you're there, and people see you, and it's your greeting, it's your warmth, you have no idea. You're teaching that little class. I remember one of our teachers of 4 and 5 year olds mentioned that I don't know how many, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever, young people that were in her class were either in the ministry or they're married and faithful in a church, and the impact of a Sunday school teacher. And see, as unknown, we may feel unknown. The people around us may think we're an unknown, but you have no idea who it is you impact. And so first of all, we don't know who we impact. Number two, the person we're impacting may not know who we're, the impact of it. We may not, I influence this person in some way, and they may not realize it for years. The things that were taught, the little truth that was caught, and they say more truth is caught than is taught. It just accidentally comes by and you grab it, and such an impact on people's lives. And I want to encourage you, the Apostle Paul, a man of his stature, was considered unknown in many places. And if you look through the list, what else he was considered, in verse 4, he was in afflictions, in necessity, in distress, in stripes, in imprisonments, in tumults, in labors, in watchings, in fastings. He had his share of problems. And yet here we are, 2020 years later, and we're talking about him through technology Paul could never have imagined. And see, that we are unknown today has no bearing on the impact we have tomorrow. I remember being in Pastor Blue's church, and I worked a couple of summers on summer staff, and I love it when I get to bring young people on staff and hire them for the summer to work for us. You have no idea the impact that happens through a church ministry. And I remember when I worked one summer the next year, I was in College, Indiana. I'm back there for a visit. I don't even remember what it was there for. It might have been the next summer. And a lady came up to me. Of course, it was a big church, and I didn't know, probably 2,000 or 3,000 people. And I'm a young Christian still. And this a grandma came up to me, and said, I just want to thank you for the impact you had on my grandchild. And I thought, not only do I not know who your grandchild is, I don't know who you are. And she said, let me explain. And one summer I worked in children's ministries. So I worked with the juniors, preteens, and was involved all summer long in children's ministries. The next summer I worked in the teen area, and I was involved with the youth pastor. And she said, my grandson came to visit last summer, whenever it was. And here we got family who's not in church, and the kids weren't in church. Well, the kids went to visit grandma. Grandma brought them to whatever it was I was running. I don't even remember what it was. And she said, at that event, my grandchild got saved. And she went on to tell a story of the ripples of that young person getting saved and all the good things that happened. And I had no idea. I had no idea who the child was. And I just want to encourage all of us to realize every day we touch somebody's life. And it might be the person at a store, it might be the next door neighbor, it might be that person in church. We have no idea. There's just no way of knowing whose life you're touching. And you may think you are unknown, and you may even to the people around you be an unknown entity, a nobody. But you have no idea how known you are. I'll share one more quick story. Knocking on doors one day, versus nighttime. There's not a lot of people home during the day, but starting at church, I knocked on doors a lot. And I remember knocking on doors and meeting a lady named Vella Wilder. And Vella Wilder was a widow and a white-haired, godly, gracious Christian lady. And I met her and chatted a little bit and went on my way. I didn't meet anybody else around there that stuck in my mind. Daytime, not a lot of people at home and people working. Well, that next Sunday, Vella came to church. And Vella had gone and talked to her next door neighbor and talked to them about coming to church. And I believe they were saved already. So she brings them to church. And they came just a few times and either got busy or our type of church wasn't for them. Whatever it was is not an issue. But, and then Vella, not long after, I can't remember if she moved and then went to heaven or she went to heaven from her home there. But regardless, she was only in our church just a little while. But the neighbor couple had, the wife of the neighbor next door had a brother who had moved to Southern California who was coming out and visiting weekends just because he was lonely and needed some company. And though Vella left and went to heaven, and though her next door neighbors only came a little while, not very long, and didn't keep coming, the brother of the wife ended up coming to church and getting saved. And he is Wayne Record, who works on our staff and has been on our staff for all these years and taught and preached in Spanish and in English and led music and has influenced our church so much. Well, you know, up in heaven, Vella Wilder knows now the influence. She might have thought she is an unknown, but she is well known. And again, you have no idea who you impact. That's why I encourage people to carry a tract and talk to people and smile and be an encouragement and realize the life of Augustus Frank. It was pretty amazing. You look at pictures of his work, or you get a copy of this book. He had a pretty amazing work. I mean, reaching, I'm going to say, thousands of orphans. But his world, he may not have felt like he was very well known, but George Mueller and the global influence of George Mueller, and through hundreds of, probably tens of thousands of books, but many books were written about him, and those books were published in hundreds of thousands and millions of copies. From the late 1600s to the late 1700s to today, we're talking about George Mueller and realizing you may think you're a nobody, but there are no nobodies in the economy of God. There are no unimportant people in the work of God. And it's so very, very important that we go into every day and say, God, use me today. Bless me. Help me be a help to somebody. Help me to be an encouragement somewhere. Help me to impact somebody. And I remember all these stories come to my mind. One preacher, and he's telling about a man who was ready to commit suicide, and he went looking for a piece of paper to write his suicide note on, and he found a gospel tract someone had passed out and put in the glove box of his car. So whoever had passed the tract out, somebody got it in the car, they put it in the glove box, left it there. The dad in the family is ready to commit suicide, goes into the glove box looking for a note to write a suicide note, finds a tract and gets saved and becomes a very faithful Christian the rest of his life. You just don't know. You may think you're unknown, but I can assure you God uses who he wants to use. And you have no idea who you're impacting today, who will ripple down and make a life just dramatically changed down here. And let's don't worry about being known. Let's worry about knowing God and staying close to him. Hey, have a great week. Thanks for coming in here on Monday morning. And I look forward to what God has planned for us these next couple of weeks. This is a good week. Then we got a week at our Young Fundamentalist Conference, then our week revival. You'll enjoy it. Great days ahead. Have a great day.